AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner.
Gary.
John, how are you?
Oh, what a crazy week, man.
Yeah.
What a crazy week. I keep wondering, should we do another show on the UAW? And we absolutely should do another show on the UAW.
All right. But before we do another show on the UAW, today is a special anniversary for something. And I know you're going to know a lot about this when I tell you what it is. It's the 69th anniversary of the Chevy small block engine.
Oh, yeah.
It debuted on this day in 1954.
Wow.
And what I find to be interesting about that is, as you well know, in January, General Motors announced that they're going to be spending $918 million to get the wherewithal to produce the 6th gen small block V8. I mean, what a wonderful engine family this has been.
Yeah, it really shows that the guys who did the original were genius at it, because obviously the engine's evolved tremendously.
Sure.
But I want to say the bore centers and, some of the other key dimensions have not changed since way back then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Ed Cole worked on that engine, as I recall.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if Ed worked on it directly, but, he was, I think he was chief engineer of Chevrolet at the time. So he would have overseen that. And of course, they were rushing to get that engine done to get it into 55 Chevy.
Mm-hmm. And according to David Cole, his son, who I happen to be, just complete coincidence. This was not connected in any way. He made the point to me that they got that engine in the 55. It was 23 months after the start of development that engine was put into the vehicles.
Yeah. So
extraordinary. Man, they did things quickly back then, didn't they?
Very quickly back then. And, they didn't have CAD CAM. They didn't have, robots. They didn't have, they did it with slide rules and big drafting tables, which is amazing.
And smart guys.
Yeah, right. That's right. Well, look, let's talk about today's show. We've got a couple of great guests. We've got Marick Master from Wayne State University, who's been on several times with us, and we love having him back. We're trying to get David Welch on from Bloomberg, too. We're having some issues, and he'll probably show up soon once we get going with this discussion. But Marick, thanks so much for coming back on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, big developments this week. At first, it's the union took down the most profitable plants in the industry with GM, Ford, and Stellantis, and then bang bang yesterday things suddenly came together really quick. What's your read of the situation?
Well, it almost seems like Sean Fain planned it out to the very minute, but no matter how you look at it, things sort of fell into place from his perspective and moved along the lines that the best he could have hoped for, I think, frankly, in terms of the amount of concessions that he's gotten across all three companies and with Ford in particular, that his strategy of striking them incrementally, waiting for them to make concessions and then going back and asking for more concessions, and then using the media to emphasize his perspective and garner public support. All those things, I think, did the trick in terms of moving the companies further than probably what they would have wanted to at the beginning. And maybe some would say probably more than they should have. And nonetheless, we're at this point, and he's got a tentative agreement with one and is applying additional pressure on the other two to come forward. And I know he's going to insist on a pattern, and the other two will have some hard bargaining ahead of them. But I think that if they're not to accede to more or less of a pattern, they're going to invite more difficulty than they probably would hope for.
Mm-hmm. So Marick, what I'm wondering about is, Kentucky Truck, the Ford plant, was taken down first, and then Sterling Heights was taken down, and then Arlington, General Motors Arlington plant. So is there any coincidence that Ford is the first to settle because they've been enduring the pain of having their major plant down the longest?
Well, I think that is more than coincidence. I think it was timed to some extent that way. And what you want to do is take the party that you're closest to a deal with and apply the most pressure on them so that you can get them to move the needle a little bit forward. And as Sean Fain said, he always felt that they had a little bit more than they could give, and that this would be something to induce them to do that. So what I thought was very interesting was that he struck the plant on October the 11th, and then gave a presentation, I think, on that Friday or sometime not too long after that, maybe it was the following Friday, and said, when he went after Ford and kind of gave the impression that he was going to strike Ford again. And that was a nice diversion because he had to know that they were making some progress at Ford, and he just wanted to keep the heat up on them, but also not let the others think that he was going to strike them in rapid succession in order to apply more pressure on them. So he's got a deal now with Ford that he's hope will be provide a basis for incentivizing the other two to come to terms with him.
Marick, I'd love to get your read of the situation, because as soon as the Ram plant and the Arlington SUV plant were struck one right after the other, a day following, I thought, oh, I think this is going to be the beginning of the end, that Sean has now struck the most profitable plants at each one of the companies. And so I read that, and I'm reading the tea leaves, right? I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I don't have any inside information on this. Now Sean could go back to his members and say, look, I took him to the mat. Because if he did not strike the most profitable plants, his base would have said all along, hey, you could have gotten more out of them.
Well, I think that's what he was really signaling when he gave his presentation on Friday and said that we're going to pressure them to the maximum. We're not going to settle until we are absolutely convinced that we've gotten the most out of them. Every last nickel and penny that we can get out of them, then we'll settle. And I think he wants to be in a position when he presents the members the tentative agreement to say, look, you may not like everything about it. We didn't get everything. Nobody can expect to get everything. But if we continue the strike, we're not likely to improve upon this offer very much, and you're going to be worse off for it. So therefore, it's something that's in your best interest to ratify, and let's hope that they do ratify it, because this is, I think, from their perspective, a very good contract.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very good contract. I mean, I wish I'd had Sean Fain negotiating for me during my career.
You know, I think that he handled it with aplomb, and he rubbed the feathers of people that he wanted to rub, and did. I think that that's deliberate on his part to aggravate them to the point of no return, and to hope they get mad. And I think that doesn't bother him in the least. But I got to give it to the company and to Bill Ford and his team that they didn't let that get in their way. They put that aside and realized that they had a bigger issue to resolve here and worked hard to get it done. And even though always one can armchair and second guess what they did, they're the ones sitting at the table, have to deal with reality. And one always doesn't get to make the sausage the way they'd like to.
Yeah. Hey, we got David Welch from Bloomberg with us. David, how you doing?
Good. How's it going?
Good. So obviously we're talking about the latest developments in the UAW strike. You've got the General Motors beat. Now Ford has settled. What are they talking about at GM, or have you gotten anything about what they're talking about?
Yeah, so the unions, I think Marick's right. They're just going to pattern this and bring it together two companies. There are always little tweaks and things that they'll do differently based on some individual circumstances, particular plants or class of workers at a company, but it'll be pretty close. GM's held out for quite the
darn.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back. Yeah. So you're starting to say GM what?
GM's had some, they've held out on a few things throughout this, right? They haven't quite, first they didn't want to give COLA, and then they offered a COLA formula that was lesser than Ford's. Same with the 401k formula at GM. And I think they had a longer grow in for temp workers to become full-time workers, which makes sense because GM has a lot more temps than Ford. That Ford has, I think, 3,000, and GM has at any one time between, I think, 6,000 and 10,000, something like that. So it's a lot more workers they'd suddenly be paying more money to. So those are the issues that they've been, where there's been a big difference. It's not insurmountable, but it's already a pretty rich contract, and I think the companies are pretty well to the end of their rope here. I think Sean Fain has extracted every dollar out of them that he could.
So I think for our viewers who aren't in Detroit and covering this so closely as we are, we should give them a sense of what we're talking about here. So what has been reported by the UAW is that there'll be 11% salary increase for the first year, and increases that will total a 25% raise over 4.5 years, which is the length of the contract. The top wage rate will go up 30% to $40 an hour. The starting wage rate will increase 68% to over $28 an hour. As David just mentioned, they're going to reinstate COLA adjustments and 3-year wage progression. They're going to end the tiers, improve the benefits for current retirees and workers with pensions and those with 401ks. And they'll be doing $5 per year of service on pensions. So 25-year employees would be making like extra money every year. 2 weeks of parental leave, 5 weeks of vacation, and Juneteenth as a holiday. So it's a pretty comprehensive package for the employees.
It is.
It certainly is.
So, Marick, what's your sense? Do you think Ford caved or the UAW caved? And, I'm just astonished at how quickly everything just started moving this week alone. And, there's been reports in the local media of strike fatigue. I'm sure you've seen it. Some people, we've seen postings claiming that they're UAW workers saying, come on, Shane, let's bring it up for a vote. We're ready to go on this. It looks like a good contract. Do you think Sean was under any pressure to get this done with now?
Oh, I think he's under extreme pressure to get it done. I think he realized that he has 13,000 workers that have been out for 6 weeks, and they're getting antsy about the kind of progress or lack thereof. They don't want to stay out another 4 weeks to get a marginally better contract. And I think he had to realize at some point that if he stood out for a longer period of time, he just wasn't going to get that much more to make it worthwhile. And you got to fold your cards at some point in time and take a risk and put it up for ratification. And what he wanted to do, I think, as you mentioned earlier, is he wanted to convince the workers that he really went to the ultimate for them. And he tried to balance the costs of the strike for both the companies. I noticed that he struck them very symmetrically. About 30 to 34% of the production was affected across the companies. And that he also only took 45 at the ultimate point, 1,000 workers out on strike, which is the equivalent of a little bit more than Stellantis workforce. So he minimized the damage, but also inflicted enough pain to bring the parties to an agreement. And I really have to look at this as that the sides come to a point of reality in these negotiations where they realize that there are just sometimes things they have to do that they don't really want to do. But otherwise, they can just fight this out interminably and inflict pain on themselves to the point that they can't recover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's under pressure from a subset of the union, but there are a lot of people who never went out. So he could conceivably drag this out longer, but I think Marick's right. I don't think he's going to get much more money. The companies have, they really opened it up here. I mean, this was a record deal about 4 offers ago.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't expect them to be as forthcoming as this. I thought that they would have resisted more. But what the dynamics were behind the closed doors, one never knows. But you've got some experienced bargainers at least at Ford, and Chuck Browning, who have a history with the company. and know the lay of the land pretty well. And that, I think, had to play some role in their coming to an agreement first, and being able to disregard all the harsh words that were said on the side.
Mm-hmm.
So Marick, during Shawn Fain's Facebook Live presentation last Friday, he reiterated the point that every time they said this is the final offer, and the UAW pushed back, they came back with more money or more benefit. And when he said that, it occurred to me that he's absolutely right. They just kept saying, no, but yes, no, but yes. At what point do you think it was that Shawn realized that this was it?
Well, in negotiations, one of the things I teach my students is don't ever bargain against yourself. And I think to some extent that's what the companies did. But I think you have to have an instinctive knowledge that you've gotten the most. And all kinds of discussions go on behind the closed doors about what the real resistance points are. And you have historical knowledge based on prior negotiations about what those are. And you look at the competition, the lay of the land. And I think it becomes clear that I read today in the Wall Street Journal that the labor costs of Ford are going to go up from $65 an hour to $88 an hour at this end of this contract. They've got a lot of work to do to remain competitive with that kind of a hit. And so their business acumen, their business strategy is going to have to be pretty keen.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions to you, Marick. Can Ford Motor Company afford this? I mean, of course, they've got the money, but from a competitive standpoint in the marketplace, they're going to have to eat these costs because, as you know, you can't pass these costs on to the customer. Maybe you can with Super Duty pickup trucks and things where there's really no international competition. It's only the crosstown rivals who compete there. But in every other segment, it's the market that's going to determine what the price of those vehicles can be. And it looks to me like Ford and soon GM and Stellantis are just going to have to eat those costs.
Well, I mean, they're encumbered in the extent to which they can pass along price increases because of market conditions. They're encumbered along the extent to which they can absorb the costs in terms of profitability by the capital investment requirements that they have for electrical vehicles. So they're going to have to find some other way. Either they come up with cost savings or they come up with new efficiencies, new technologies to make the production process more efficient. And I think that would have to be where their focus is. And I noticed that, they're focusing on the lithium battery and reducing their dependence on scarce raw materials has been a trend in the industry. And I think that anything that they can do along those lines to shave costs, any place in the supply chain, is something they're going to be looking at.
Look, there are a couple of things here. First of all, because union workers are locked into a contract and so are the companies, they got pretty small raises over the past 4 years. That wasn't necessarily true in the rest of the labor market, where there was inflation and wage increases, and the labor market's been tight. So people in other sectors have gotten pretty good raises just because of competition for people out there. So in some ways, these raises that everyone in Detroit is wringing their hands over and saying, oh my God, the end is nigh, they're catching up to what other sectors have already had to pay. All right, so that number one. Number two, Mary Barra told me this herself, like labor's 5% of their costs. So if you raise that by, say, let's call it 30% here, 30% of 1%, or I'm sorry, of 5% is like a little over 1%. So while we were sitting here, one of the viewers chimed in with a comment, the big three are going bankrupt. I'll be polite to this guy. He could take his sandwich sign off. They're not going bankrupt over a 1% increase in cost. It does hurt their profits, no question. So where are they going to find the money? We know where they're going to find the money, John. We've been watching it for the past year. The average price of a vehicle is $51,000, and it got as high as $53,000 at GM. And out in the market, it used to be $50,000, and now it's like, $49.3 or something like that. They're not going to make cheap, stripped down models for anybody anymore. They haven't been. They're just going to keep selling expensive cars because it's not profitable to make smaller, cheap cars. That's where it's going to come from.
Yeah.
They'll cut some costs, you'll find efficiencies, but at the end of the day, it's going to be pricing because that's what they've been doing. Before, the question was, can they hold this semiconductor era pricing, high pricing? And everyone said, no, they're going to get greedy and lay out the incentives. No, they're not. They can't. This says that they can't now. Their costs just went up by 1%, which is a lot of money in actual dollars. It's not going to make them bankrupt. But, if you want to go out there and get a $21,000 or $19,000 vehicle, or a stripped down version of something that starts at 32, you won't find it.
Yeah, I think if you calculate out the cost increase in an average vehicle sale, if you just average it out across them, it'd be, in the case of Ford, something like $800 in North American sales that they'd have to increase your average car. And that's doable. And they can, they're going to have revenues of close to $200 billion a year. And therefore, this is a marginal increase for them. But everything at the margin is sort of how you operate and what you can cut back and where you can be competitive. And they obviously want to hold their labor costs down as well as their other costs. So he's right that they're catching up. And I think that was his case. I think workers in general are trying to catch up. They've seen their wages stagnating for decades. And they've seen the upper 1% get higher wages, the concentration of wealth increase. And they're looking for some rebalance in terms of the position of labor and capital. And with the diminished labor movement, you don't have the kind of situation in which people were getting regular pay increases built into contracts anymore. You only have 6% of the workforce covered by labor unions, and the rest are at the mercy of the market, which in recent years has been relatively good to labor compared to what it has been in the past. But still, workers haven't gone up. Most of their wage gains have been eaten up by inflation over the past couple of years. And they're going to be continually looking for a way to get ahead. And I think this contract gave them a chance to feel that maybe not only they caught up, but maybe they just got a little bit ahead as well.
Mm-hmm. Marick, do you think that there's a possibility of a domino effect that will take place such that, it just isn't the direct cost of the UAW worker for General Motors or Stellantis or Ford, but their suppliers are going to be facing the need to pay their people more, and the suppliers to the suppliers and so on, that would cause a rise in the cost of a vehicle?
Well, I certainly think that you can have that kind of repercussion, because even if you're non-union, one of the strategies you use to avoid a union is substituting what the unions pay. And that the companies that are non-union will realize that they may have to raise their wages in order to stay non-union. So you have that kind of residual effect of these contracts. And you also have workers in general thinking that there's more out there to be had and people asking for more. And they're going to feel that particularly if the job market continues to perform as it has and the economy grows at the pace that it has recently, that you're going to continue to see an upward pressure on wages. And I think the Federal Reserve's concerned about that. And that's one of the reasons why it hasn't let loose all its efforts to control inflation.
Paul, as you see the questions popped up there, how are suppliers doing? They're doing terrible. I can tell you that, volume's down. They can't get the price raises that they want because raw material prices have gone up. The economics, as they call it. Suppliers are, the tier ones that supply to all the major automakers. They're feeling the pain, but they'll get through. It's the smaller family-owned tier 2s and 3s that are. We'll see if they get through this.
You've got thousands of those small suppliers out there that are employ very few people, and those that are dependent on the auto industry are going to be the hardest hit. And if you're a supplier that has a broader base, then you're going to be a little bit more immunized. But it's a challenging time for them to begin with. I mean, I've seen studies from Deloitte and elsewhere that indicate that the financial situation of many of them is less than desirable. And so anything like this has direct implications for them.
Yeah. I still think this is going to make it much more difficult for the Detroit Three to compete, this contract. Marick, you say it could raise the price of a car by $800. Back when they were still making passenger cars in the last decade, GM and Ford, Stellantis, they were making about $1,200 profit on a vehicle. And that's one reason why they don't build passenger cars in the United States anymore, with a few exceptions. There's Cadillac and there's Mustang. But they're out of the pass car business because they can't make any money on it. The only affordable cars that are sold in this market today come from Mexico or South Korea. They're not made in the United States. And I think that's an issue. I personally believe they're opening the door for the Chinese to come in at some point. And, David, look, to get your viewpoint on this, GM stock, I think today was trading at $27 a share. It's trading at a lower price than it was 10 to 15 years ago. GM's market cap is like $37 billion. Doesn't that open the door for potential, corporate raider to come in and buy GM? I mean, 37 billion is a big number in my book, but in the auto industry, it's not that much.
It's not. I mean, look, that's still a very big check for you. You would need a consortium of private equity funds together, and those deals haven't been done in a long time. So the question is who's going to buy it, and then the question is why would they want it?
Right.
And I mean, look, and I say that because investors just hate car companies. I was actually talking to a Wall Street analyst about this today. If GM goes out and has an awesome quarter, and I've said this on Bloomberg TV too, but we've seen it. The analysts, there's a sell-off in the stock, and the analysts say, it's all downhill from here because they had a great quarter. And then the next quarter, they have a not-so-great quarter. They don't say, there's clearly upside. They say, yeah, we told you, and they sell off again. And then, for a while, they loved GM's EV strategy, but then when it didn't turn out, hundreds of thousands of EVs sold a year, they hated it. Then, for a while, they started saying, well, GM's pushing in EVs, but they don't make any money and demand is uncertain. So they started punishing GM stock whenever GM gave an update that was, investors don't like auto stocks. They don't. Tesla, they view as a different animal. Yeah, I don't know who would want this thing. But, look, another thing you have to look at with GM share price. Go back to Tuesday. They removed their guidance on earnings because of the strike. The union went on strike at Arlington, their most profitable plant. They removed their guidance on EV sales because, they're throttling back the Orion electric truck plant. And they lost their permit to operate autonomous vehicles in San Francisco with Cruise. And that all happened before noon. And the stock just got hammered. And there's no reason for it to come back up. I think once the strike settles, it'll come back up again because the near-term earnings risk is gone, but investors will still hate the fact that their costs are higher. These are capital-intensive companies with low margins compared to tech companies and everything else out there. Investors just don't really love them. It's going to be a couple of years before we see Ford and GM with what anyone considers meaningful numbers of EV sales, and that could get investors interested. And they're going to have to show profit doing it. So that's a few years away. I think these guys are just going to have to gut it out for a few years before the stocks are of interest to anybody.
So, Marick, one of the things that I didn't see related to the proposed agreement goes to the battery plants. Are you familiar with any agreement that may have been reached there?
No, I don't believe that there has been anything reported about that. And that is a question that a lot of folks are asking, particularly in light of GM. And it's still unclear what GM negotiated with the UAW. And I don't even know if that's been finalized at this point in time. It's a thorny legal issue. I know that a group of U.S. senators, Democratic senators, have called upon the companies to incorporate those JVs into the national agreements, and that in response to that letter, one of the leaders of Ultium Cells sent a letter to Senator Brown, I believe it was addressed, saying that that really wasn't in the realm of possibility at this time. But then you have the concession that apparently has been made that at least one of the plants will be recognized under the National Master Agreement, but it's unclear what that means and if it'd have the same contract. So I think this is going to be something that's just going to have to be sorted out. I think the union is deliberately quiet about it because it's a permissive item of negotiation, and they're not absolutely certain what they're going to get and don't want to tout it too much. And I also think it's very noteworthy. If you look at their list of demands that they made publicly and what they talk about, they don't mention this. Right. They did mention it during the presentation when GM made this concession and that he exempted GM from a strike action that week. But they're relatively quiet about this. So discussions have been going on behind the scenes. And I'm like everybody else, I'm awaiting the details.
David, have you learned anything about that? GM and the battery workers?
Look, a lot of proposals have been kicked around about this. And they are, by the way, like they're negotiating a deal for the Ultium plant down in Lordstown because it was organized separately. It's just not part of this national agreement. You know, the unions floated a bunch of ideas. One was that all the workers would be part of the national agreement and GM would lease them to the joint ventures. GM had no interest in that because that means, you know, the union negotiates great wages and then GM has to go and negotiate reimbursement from the joint venture, which they don't totally control because you've got a Korean battery partner there. So it's an open-ended cost for them. I think what will end up happening is you do have these other workers, parts distribution plan workers and such. They're in the national agreement, but with sort of a supplemental agreement or side letters and things like that. So I think that's what we'll end up seeing. And also, I think the companies will promise to basically use a card check or, you know, neutrality agreements during organizing drives. But look, you can't legally bargain on behalf of people in plants that don't exist.
Yeah.
They haven't been hired yet. And, you know, this has always been a thorny issue. When we interviewed Sean Fain before talks started this a few months back, he admitted that. He said, look, you know, there are some legal issues here and the companies have to be willing to do this stuff. Not very forceful at all about it. And you know, Marick points out, you know, absence of discussion about this in a lot of Sean Fain's demands. And there are other things he hasn't talked about much lately that didn't show up in the Ford agreement, like the 32-hour work week. Sean hasn't really talked about that in a long time on his Facebook Live events. And he's talked less about pensions, and the Ford deal did not have defined benefit pensions. It had 401k, you know, richer 401k matches and contributions. So, you know, you have to look at what Sean doesn't talk about. And so I think I think they're working on something that'll sort of pave the way for the unions to get into those plans and a way to compensate them once they are. But you can't.
Yeah, I think that's
if they don't exist.
Permissive items, which is what this is called, assuming it is a permissive item, and I think there's some legal opinion that it is, but you can't bargain them to an impasse. If he were to bargain them to an impasse, he'd have risk an unfair labor practice. And I'm certain that he doesn't want to be saddled with that at the present time and would rather just try and sort that out. But Ultium is further along than some of the other joint ventures in terms of hiring and status, and they've had a union representation election and won. And the company's position initially was that the union was going to have to go to each one of the JVs, talk to the management there, and then negotiate a agreement on whether they're going to be easily recognized or they're going to have to go through the conventional approach to do it. And then they're going to have to negotiate their own contract, which will be separate from the National Master Agreement. The union would argue that these joint ventures are really creatures of the two owners and that they can do what they want, and that they should recognize the union and put them under the National Master Agreement. Who knows what that might happen? I think the National Labor Relations Board, with some of its recent decisions, would be favorably impressed with voluntary recognitions of the union, as long as you could show a majority interest. And I think at some point in time, they're going to have to show that a majority of workers in those facilities want the union before they're going to give them recognition. And that's the way it should be under the law, but there are lots of different ways they can give them recognition. And what the NLRB has said most recently is that if a union claims recognition of a majority and the company doesn't grant it, then there could be liabilities to the company for that. That's created really a big stir in the field. But this is an issue, I think, as Peter Drucker once said, you pay more attention to what people don't say sometimes than what they do say. And I particularly pay attention that they didn't say anything about defined benefit plans, as David pointed out. They didn't say anything about retiree health care. They didn't say anything about the 32-hour work week. And I always kind of wondered whether that was a real demand or just something they just kind of threw out there to discuss. But clearly they loaded up their package with lots of things and were able to settle on, use the whole rubric of retirement security to embellish their defined contribution plans, which may have been the purpose to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Hey, look, we got to take a quick commercial break right now. We'll come back. I want to know about next steps. Where does this leave the transplants and Tesla and all that? But first, a shout out to our sponsors.
How do Bridgestone tires stop shorter on wet roads? It's their HydroTrack technology. But you don't have to know how the science works, just where the brake is. What really matters is their Bridgestone.
Thank you, Bridgestone. Thank you, Borg Warner. Marick, where do you think this leaves the transplants in Tesla? I mean, you're saying this is probably going to get Ford up to $80 an hour, all in benefits, everything. That's, by most estimates, almost twice the labor cost at Tesla. It's probably close to some of the twice the labor costs at Hyundai, Kia, plants in the U.S. I'm talking about, not in South Korea and the like. Doesn't the union have to go out and organize these plants now?
Well, it does, and it's hoping that this contract will provide ammunition for it to do so. I have real questions in my mind about how successful the UAW will be. Its track history in this area is not particularly impressive, and I don't think that's just because it's got a blemished image. I think it's because the way it conducts organizing campaigns. I think one of the reasons Sean Fain is in the presidency now of the union is because the International has always had a reputation for being very heavy-handed, not listening to rank and file, not listening to locals, and going in and conducting organizing campaigns that really didn't pay attention to what people wanted. And so there's a lot of blame that I think the union owns in terms of why it hasn't been successful. And I think it'll be an uphill climb no matter what. Anytime the UAW shows up any place, you can rest assured groups are going to mobilize against it, and they're going to have lots of ammunition that they can use. And one of the things they will use frequently is that this union prices companies out of business and it forces layoffs. And if you look at what's happened in the industry, I remember I was working with a group of steel executives when I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I talked about, what do you think about the steel workers? And they said, well, what they said is unprintable, and I'm certainly not going to say this on, even though they had them unionized, but they said, look, we have no use for them. And they make it more difficult for us to operate. Their job classification restrictions and all down the line encumber us. And we would prefer not to have unionized facilities. And I think that's absolutely the case. And many of the Japanese automakers, when they came here, they went to unionized companies in the U.S. and asked them how do they stay away from unions, and they got the advice. And so I think they got a steep climb ahead of them, and if they don't, they're going to be in a shrinking position. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that, even though it's not a large part of their overall costs, companies will look to save money where they can. And I think substituting capital for labor will be one of the things they'll emphasize even more going ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow.
I think it'd almost be better if a different union tried to organize transplants in the Tesla plants. Maybe Teamsters. I think they do a very good job of listening to people. Look, this is probably the best chance in 70 years that the union has to have success in organizing, because you've seen organizing drives at Amazon distribution centers. You've seen it, I think, at Starbucks and other places. So, there's a comeback for unions, and surveys show that Americans have a more favorable view of unions. And I think part of that is because of something Marick touched on early on, which is, a lot of Americans, even those who don't work in auto plants or any kind of plant, they feel poor these days because on social media, they can see how much the top 1% and 2% are making and what they drive and what they have. And then you look at, the average price of a new car is almost $50,000, even though it's come down a bit. The average American salary can't reasonably afford that for the most part, unless they're putting too much into the monthly payment. College education, even worse. Healthcare costs. There are core things that it's not just people are annoyed with, like when they go and pay more for eggs, they can't touch it. And so some people are looking to unions to be a solution to this. They've got it. The UAW has a shot. But yeah, there are a lot of things that companies can say. Bankrupt GM, bankrupt Chrysler. Past 2 UAW presidents did time. There's a lot of stuff you can put in an anti-union campaign when the UAW comes knocking. That's why I think Shawn Fain was so adamant that they get a really good deal. And, one thing we reported is he wanted to say all in, they got 30%, including COLA, so that would be the banner they can wave in organizing drives. We can get you a 30% raise. So, look, this deal will help them, but the UAW is just so bad at organizing. Maybe another union does need to organize.
Yeah, I think David hit on something that's really important. The fight that they have, I think institutionally, unions, if you looked at them as a business and their market share had declined as much, you'd say that really some of them ought to go out of business, but yet they stay in business. And the Teamsters, while they are good at doing certain things, they also come with a lot of baggage. They were under government control for more than 30 years. And just to show you a difference between the Teamsters and the UAW, whenever you're under one of those consent decrees, they list the people that you are barred from associating with in the union. And there were several people, and Gary Jones, the former president, would be one, and Dennis Williams would be another, high-profile cases. In the case of the UAW, the number of people listed was about 15 to 20. In the case of the Teamsters, it was over 700.
Wow.
And the magnitude of the Teamsters scandal, because it was mob infested, was so much greater. You had really some personal greed scandals that ran awry, and people took advantage of the joint training centers, which I think were a bad idea, though not in principle, but the way they were financed and managed by the company and the union led to these kinds of problems, or at least facilitated them happening. But I'm not certain what the solution is to unions. I've given this a lot of attention as a researcher and as somebody who, pays attention to the labor movement. And you might say I'm pro-union. I believe in collective bargaining and the right to unionize. But I'm not certain how labor gets its way out of it. And it hasn't shown. It may be the best chance in 70 years, but I would say it's still not a very good chance.
Yeah, look, one of the problems they have is, I think you look at Toyota and Honda plants, I think those workers are pretty happy, and the companies do a good job of managing people, and they do pay them pretty well. Tesla is a different situation. I think Elon Musk would do everything he could and probably dance on the line of what's allowed to keep the union out. And he is pretty good at scaring people. And also, by the way, I think one thing he'll say is, stock options, stock grants go away. And even though those grants haven't done well the past 2 years for workers, hope springs eternal. And, having stock in Teslas, that appeals to a lot of people. And I, just threatening to take that away is going to make an organizing drive really, really difficult. I would think if the union has a chance anywhere, it would be the Korean plants. They don't pay as well. They've been cited by OSHA for severe violations over the past decade. They had a lot of injuries. Business Week did a report on that a few years ago. So I think they've cleaned that up. But where pay is lower and there's a bad safety record for the union to campaign on, that's where they have a shot. But getting into Toyota and Honda, I mean, John, I don't know. You and I have probably talked about that on your show. These unsuccessful drives, who knows how many times over the past 20 years.
That's right. No, I mean, I dating myself, of course, I remember talking to Doug Fraser, and Doug Fraser telling me in the very early 1980s after Honda came in, he said, just you wait, because I was saying, you guys can't organize there. He says, not now, but you just wait. They're going to crank up that line speed, and the workers are going to get dissatisfied, and that's going to be our end. Well, that was 40 years ago, and it's never happened. You know why? Because Honda never cranked up the line speed.
Marick, do you find that right-to-work legislation has an effect on whether there's unionization or not?
What we know about right to work is the effect of that legislation is not so much on reducing membership within existing bargaining units, because a lot of unions like the UAW have gotten pretty sophisticated about dealing with situations in right to work state and being able to bolster their membership within those existing bargaining units. But what happens is it makes it more difficult to organize within the state itself, because it's really reflective of an environment that is less hospitable. And so unions invest less in organizing, and when they do try to organize, they face more of an uphill battle. They've got suspicious workers out there who take a good hard look not only at the companies. It's not that they necessarily trust the companies, but they don't trust the union. And so they think that union bosses or unions get them into trouble, and they don't want to take that. They've got pretty good, decent existence, and they don't want to risk it. And companies can, David talks about dancing on the line. What are the consequences of crossing the line? I'm not going to say some companies cross the line, but I do know some that do. The consequences are minimal. And for their point of view, from a cost benefit analysis, if you keep a union out, I mean, if I wanted to keep a union out, I'd basically tell all my managers that if you let a union in here, well, I guess there's another employer that would like you.
No, but it's interesting, if you look at the states that do have right to work on the books, many of these states are states which have Korean manufacturers and Japanese manufacturers. And so to your point, that also makes it more difficult for those plants to be
organized. It's a cause and effect thing, and they're so entangled that it's the political, social, economic climate in those settings, as well as the legal climate that you face in trying to organize it. And although there are polls and there are surveys that academics do, and they find, roughly 40% of the workers that were polled said if given a chance, they'd vote for a union in a certification election. That's a generic question. If you ask at your particular work site, with this union trying to represent you at a given point in time, with the employer doing this or that, would you vote accordingly? That's really the question that you have to ask. And people will look and realize that there are risks to doing that. And And although you might want to cross the line of the law, you can be, as a management, very heavy-handed in terms of how you deal with the union organizing effort.
Or do you think Sean Fain's rhetoric during this strike, which was really nasty about the companies and CEO salaries and that sort of thing, corporate greed, would that appeal to workers in plants that aren't organized, or would that scare them, thinking that, they'd like a union to represent them, but this one's pretty hardcore and could bring some bad consequences?
I think it's going to have a group of people that it's going to appeal to, those that are more leftist in nature, that are more hostile to companies. But people know where their bread is buttered. And if you're in a state or a setting where there are relatively few employment opportunities that are that good, I think you're going to be reluctant to want to risk it. And I also think that there's a generational difference. And I don't think most people like the harsh language that's being used. It's reminiscent of me to the language that John Lewis and other labor leaders of the past used, in which they were very coarse, very harsh, very insulting. And they did it as a way of antagonizing the other side and rallying the troops. I think Sean Fain has a group of people around him which are very much of a similar mind and have very strong views about the role of labor in society and the role of business in society. And they don't all accord with something that synchronizes well with a purely capitalistic society.
Mm-hmm. There's another issue with what, I understand blue collar anger, working class anger over inflation, lack of wage increases for the last 20, 30 years completely. In some ways, the auto industry kind of, the three companies here are paying for what's happened in America, and they're not all that guilty. Their workers actually get paid relative to others pretty well. If you want to look at where there's disparity in CEO pay and stock prices that reward shareholders, a company like Apple that has workers in Taiwan making iPhones at less than UAW workers would make here, while their CEO makes a lot of money, more than Mary Barra does, and their shareholders have gotten extremely rich. Amazon, similar thing. They don't pay people a lot of money in these warehouses, and their owners and their CEO, their CEO is fabulously wealthy. Marick Barr makes a lot of money, and so does Jim Farley, but the disparity is not near what it is with some of these tech-oriented companies. And that's kind of where the anger is focused these days. But the UAW kind of fought that fight where they can, which is with the car companies. So they're paying a very rich contract on that same theme, but the pay wasn't, the pay that they get isn't that bad compared to other unskilled labor.
I think that's a very good point, and I'll probably get myself fired at the university for saying I'm a capitalist, but I am a capitalist, and I'm not against people getting wealthy, and believe that there's a lot to be said for people that have those ambitions and aspirations, and entrepreneurs that want to do that. But at the same time, I think a lot of workers that don't have the healthcare that the auto workers have, where they only pay a fraction of their cost compared to what your typical worker pays. At Ford, they pay 3% of their cost of healthcare. Your typical manufacturing worker pays 30%. They're talking about increasing the wages of workers in General Motors to $84,000, probably higher than that at Ford in the $90,000. And a lot of people look at that and say, these are really good conditions. And when the UAW asks for defined benefit plans and retiree health care, most workers look at it as something they don't have. I remember I was an advisor to a company one time that negotiated a VIVA with a union, and this was before the UAW did it. And we did a study on the extent to which employers provided retiree health care, and found out, just very few of them did. And this was many years ago. And now it's even fewer. And as a result of that, a lot of workers are going to say, how can you ask for a 32-hour work week, retiree health care, and defined benefit plans on top of all the other things you're asking for? And they're going to think that that's something a little bit maybe out of the pale of reason. But nonetheless, from their perspective, these are things that they had, that they gave up, are suspended in their mind, and they want to reclaim to raise the standard of living for the working class. And it goes into what you define as a rightful share of profits, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Hey, we're going to get close to the end of the show here, but I wanted to get your guys' opinion of what's going to happen next year. David, let's start with you. GM, Stellantis, do they follow suit with Ford very quickly? Does it drag out longer? What's your crystal ball?
I think they'll do it fairly quickly. The one thing I didn't think Stellantis would want to give in on was the right to strike over plant closings, because I thought, okay, Carlos Tavares, having followed him at a couple different companies now, he'd say, fine, we'll give you this rich contract, and he'd just start closing plants and moving things to Mexico. Not en masse, but I thought he would. But now the union can strike over that. Devil's in the detail. We'll have to read how that actually comes out in the contract and how much they have in terms of rights. But look, I think they pretty quickly come to a deal here, and then it's going to be interesting because Sean Fain does have a vision of organizing and using this deal to do that. And now he's got to live up to his side of the bargain and make the competitors of these three companies have somewhat competitive contracts. And I think his heart's in the right place on that. I don't think he can get it done.
Mm-hmm. Marick, how do you think the rest of this strike's going to play out?
I think that assessment is about right on target. I think that they will probably have some difficult issues to sort out, but they should be able to do that within a few days. Unless there's something really thorny in there that they can't get done. And I would just put that probably in the category of the joint ventures that I just don't know much about. It may be behind the closed doors, but assuming that it's just the economic matters, they'll narrow the gaps enough to get it done. And then I think that he's got a contract that he can sell to the membership. I think the membership is going to be anxious that they're not on strike anymore, and those that weren't on strike are going to be glad that they weren't called out and they didn't lose pay for 4 to 6 weeks. And they'll move on to the challenges that face them. The companies will have the structural challenge of electrification, and the union will have the challenge of organizing in the industry. So neither set of those parties has an easy task ahead of it.
Mm-hmm. Gary, any thoughts? How you think this is going to play out?
I can nearly guarantee that next week's show will not be about a strike. So,
right. Yeah, I know. I felt that it would probably take another week or two for the others to come in. I love hearing what you're saying, Marick, that it might be a few days. The sooner this gets over with and the industry gets back, the Detroit-based industry gets back to building cars, the better off everyone's going to be.
And then they can wait for somebody, as David said, who really wants to buy a car company.
That's
that would
right.
change the world, wouldn't it?
That would. Well, real good, you guys. We're going to wrap this up, but thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. I'd love to stay afterwards and chat, but I've got to run to another event, and pleasure being both with all of you. And nice to meet you, David. Enjoyed your comments very much.
Good
Thanks,
chatting. Take care, guys.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner.
If you like this program and would like to learn more about the automotive industry, check out our website at autoline.tv or look for us on YouTube on the AutoLine channel.